We've described a game as a meaningful decision with an uncertain outcome and measurable results.
And everyone's mad at us about it.
Everyone's
so mad at us.
is a little perturbed about this definition. So we thought we would put a video together that better explains that point of view, where it comes from, how we got to that conclusion, and what our goal is with that definition.
Distraction makers.
When exploring this idea, what we've been trying to find is exactly what does the medium of games do best.
Yeah, especially in relation to other mediums. So something like a book, there's still interaction between, the author, the words, and then the reader, and how that reader interprets those words. But like, you're not moving the words around and creating a new story necessarily.
We're a little less concerned is joining the debate of really being very nitpicky as to, okay, well, does that make this a game or does that make this a game? And that's kind of, I don't know, like maybe it could. That's sort of up to you. I don't think we're here to necessarily go and dictate and tell other people what could or could not be considered a game in this way. These are more of guidelines that we like to follow that I think help us as designers.
We're more concerned with, what are some guiding principles to what we feel is a minimum viable complete game. So let me elaborate on what complete means. So to be clear, this idea is not saying that any other experience is lesser. It's just that it's different. So when we say that a meaningful decision, an uncertain outcome, and measurable results is a complete game, we're just saying that it's a game that takes advantage of what games can do in its most complete.
Right. You're missing some sort of a vector of, interaction for the player to experience.
If you're missing any of those pieces.
Right.
Yeah. So we're going to go through a little bit and sort of talk about what happens if you remove each of these pieces. And part of this definition was one sort of through subtraction, right? We're trying to figure out like, okay, we're going to remove as many pieces of this as we can until we get down to we can't remove any more, because if we do, then it becomes some other kind of experience. So let's go through the three pieces that we say make up a complete game. And we'll remove one piece and see what other kind of experience is created. So meaningful decision, uncertain outcome, measurable results. We're going to remove meaningful decision. So we have no meaningful decision, but we have uncertain results and we have a measurable feedback. What kind of experience do we then have?
Right. And that's a game of chance, right? So you can enter into it, but your participation arguably is potentially the only meaningful decision, and that's outside of the game system, so that's something we're not going to really bother considering. So really, it's just you engaging in this thing. You don't know how it's going to happen, but you know what the end results are.
So in order for your decision to sort of be meaningful, it has to have some kind of impact on the outcome, right? So when we look at a game of chance, we say, okay, well, what kind of decision can I make that would influence the outcome of this game? And if there isn't any, well, then you have a game of chance, meaning that you're rolling dice or flipping a coin or whatever it is. Doesn't matter what you do. You could blow on the dice and roll them. It doesn't change that they're still just random.
Yeah, you could make the argument that like at a roulette table, right, the way that you end up sort of stacking and moving chips depending on how you're wanting to place your bet doesn't really matter because it's not necessarily changing the overall like probabilities, like you're saying. You're not having an impact on the game. Your decisions can technically I guess, give you different results, but your participation is really the only thing that is changing the game here.
I'm going to head this one off a little bit because I think some people are going to say, well, what about like if the physics of the roulette table aren't perfect or whatever, there could be like particular results that come up more often. It's like, okay, sure. But we're talking about systems specifically, not the little, like the actual physical expressions of these things. Yeah, you could have loaded dice. This isn't to say that like a game of chance isn't fun, right? Of course it could be fun, but we're also saying that like fun is not part of our definition of games, right? It could
That's
be...
a whole other video.
That's a whole other video. But for a moment, we're going to say that like, fun is not necessary for a game to exist.
Right.
Fun can be part of a game. It can be the goal of a game, but it's not necessary. So let's keep the meaningful decision this time. And instead, let's remove the uncertainty in outcome. So we have a meaningful decision, no uncertainty in outcome, and then measurable results. And in this instance, we have what we would probably describe as a puzzle. And that's because the result is always the same in a puzzle, right? There's a solution, like that solves the puzzle, right? And so you have meaningful decision in the way that you manipulate the pieces of the game, and then you have measurable results because theoretically, when the puzzle is complete, you've solved it, and then that's the end of the experience.
For the most part, there's one specific way of solving this thing, meaning that there is a certainty in its solution.
Okay, so then the last one is we have meaningful decision, uncertain outcome, and no measurable results. So what is that?
Great question. I know we should probably.
It's nothing.
It's nothing. I mean, an unfinished game, right? It's technically like, yeah, you could have played a game, but you don't actually know what the final results are. So it's whatever. This is actually the weirdest one, and I think is one that is a great example for why I think that these three are such great pillars to go off of when considering designing games, because it really this one in particular really shows, like, if you don't see the outcomes of something, did you participate? Was that even a game? What was the purpose of you actually experiencing this thing? And I mean, imagine playing I don't know, any sort of a game, and halfway through you just walk away and get up, and it's like, okay, well, I guess you were participating in it, but at that point, like, did you play a game of this thing at that point?
Well, and like, in an interesting way, you could look at this as just being like, I guess, like an activity or something, right? There's no like particular measurable result, so you don't know if somebody won or lost.
No one's tracking anything.
Nobody's tracking anything. So this could just be an activity, right? Like you're just shooting hoops.
This is sort of the pillar that represents having a goal or an objective. So it makes sense if you remove the goal or objective, it is just sort of it doesn't matter what you're doing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and on like the flip side of that, like, why is that so important for a game, right? And part of that is because it's the signal that you have completed a cycle of the game to then potentially go back and start that cycle, that loop over again, to then reapply what you've learned. And so if we're looking at sort of games as a medium of learning, of agency, in order to understand what you can take away, you have to have an endpoint to reevaluate what you've done to accomplish that endpoint.
Right. And even further zoomed out, if we're looking at games as sort of exploration of like real world situations, right, or a simulation of real life events, the majority of the time that usually has to have some sort of a goal, right? Especially if it's all ingrained in like survival instincts. Then what is that, right? What was that exact goal? Was it to hunt? Was it to gather, etc.? Without that, there's no point in you having this sort of test of skill in the first place, right? There's nothing to measure it.
Yeah, and I think in some ways, like maybe like some role-playing games fit in this category. But even then, like, you can still have a goal, a measurable result, like you've completed the story or you've leveled up, or like there's still pillars, right? But the game doesn't necessarily end. So I don't know, that's kind of in a gray area for me a little bit.
I think it also, where a lot of people kind of maybe we lose some people on this, is that there's plenty of games, especially like online games, MMOs, that don't necessarily have any sort of an explicit goal given to the player, right? You start playing an MMO, and a lot of people maybe say that the goal is to get to end game, but even if that's not the case, right, and you're just going and questing, this is where we could get into like subgames. Subgames are essentially just like microcosms of games within a game that still follow, ideally, as much of these sort of three pillars as possible to maintain its gaminess. And a lot of the times that ends up being these sort of micro goals, right? So completing a quest, completing an objective, going and killing a thing are all minor forms of measurable results leading up in your quest.
Similarly to how, like, a scene in a story contributes to the overall story, and if it doesn't like serve the story. A sub game that doesn't have any kind of result on the main game itself is probably one that doesn't need to exist, right? So by that nature, a sub game must somehow impact the outcome of the overall game. In like a MMO role-playing setting, that would be something like, okay, well, I'm gaining experience for doing this thing, or I'm gaining an item reward. And what's interesting about sort of some of the, like, these measurable results in an MMO setting, you still gain levels, right? So that might be your first goals. Okay, I want to get to max level. But then once you're at max level, that goal just sort of shifts to, I want the best gear.
Yeah,
right?
Usually then it's not a level that's the number you're trying to go up, but it's a different number that you're trying to go up.
Well, and we've even like a lot of MMOs have picked up like item levels, right? Which is quite similar to, or like you have like a gear rating or something that tells you, oh, how, like that's just another form of leveling at that point. It's just another form of experience. It's just now handled through how good your items are instead of you being able to level up just by doing whatever. So let's come back around to exhausted games for a minute. And exhausted games means that it was a complete game, meaning it has all pieces of what makes up the totality of the medium of games, but for whatever reason, the perception of the player is that it doesn't satisfy one of these anymore. This brings in the factor of player perception, and the easiest way to describe this is with something like tic-tac-toe, where when you first start playing it as a kid, you can view this as, well, my decisions are meaningful, the outcome is uncertain, and the results are measurable, therefore it's a game, right? It's a complete game. But over time, you could realize that, the zero level heuristic, the first strategy that you learn is so powerful that it subverts any idea of there being meaningful decision because there's just one best thing to do. Thus, it becomes an exhausted game, which means it's no longer a game to you, but it still might be a game to someone else.
Any one of these sort of pillars, I guess we talked about some of the complications if it's measurable results, but in particular, I think the most common one that this ends up having is not just meaningful decisions, but certainty and outcome. And so a lot of the times someone might play through a particular game, maybe it's like a story-driven game or something like that, and once the story is sort of complete, you understand now, okay, what were the results of this? Now it's not this uncertainty of where am I going, what's happening with the story. The story is now there, and now that I've reached a sort of certain outcome, you could play through again, but at that point you're just sort of participating again in these sort of activities or challenges, but you have a certainty of where the overall game is going to be ending.
You know, some games take advantage of this by adding multiple endings or, you know, different events that happen along the way that you didn't see, but ultimately that experience can still be exhausted because you'll eventually find all of the options.
And what usually ends up happening in this case is that those games transfer into being an exhausted game, but are treated a little bit more as a sort of like a calming activity, right? Or a comforting activity that is something someone will repeatedly do just because at that point they're now, I guess, comfortable with the experience and want to sort of maintain that as much as possible.
Yeah, and it's not, again, this isn't a value judgment of any experience or whether or not something is a game or isn't a game. It's just that it's sort of how a game progresses through our understanding of it as we're moving through these pieces and exhausting the game as we're doing it. And I think that, like, yeah, people still play exhausted games all the time, but at that point, it's less of a game activity as defined by the medium. It could be more of a ritual, or it could be more of an activity, a thing that brings comfort in repetition, right? Of wanting to continue to exist in that world, even though now you know how the story unfolds or whatever. It's not that the experience is lesser, it's just a different experience. Okay, so what can we as designers learn from this idea? How is this applicable to when we're making games?
To me, I think one of the most eye-opening changes that I had as a designer was when I started recognizing design as a lens of a skill, similar to when I was getting good at art. And the thing that I think helped a lot with getting good at art was really understanding the absolute core principles of this. And I think that this is something that a lot of designers have tried to do, and there's a lot of research out there on this, but I feel like the two of us have sort of found that there's a lack of some of these terms and a lack of some of this refinement. And I think being able to find these like very, very core fundamental principles of what makes up games, not just in like a game theory, economic theory sense, but in a design sense, is very eye-opening. And it's great to be able to fall back on these things because you're able to pinpoint, like, why is my thing not working? And you can point to one of these three things and go, is this the problem that I'm having?
Some of trying to come to this conclusion was inspired by Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics. And in that book, he does a very good job of defining like what the medium of comics is best at and what separates it from movies or novels or whatever else. And so once you sort of can understand how to take full advantage of the medium, it allows you to do what you're saying. Like you can start to run through this as not quite a checklist, but like it's a gut check of like, okay, what am I doing? Am I fulfilling these criteria? Am I creating a system that's easily exhausted? Do I need to augment what I'm doing in a way that maintains the gameness longer term, why are players feeling like this experience isn't full? It isn't complete, and maybe it's not. It might not just be that you are lacking any of these elements. It might be that these elements are not being clearly demonstrated, clearly communicated, rather than just not there at all. They might be there. It just might be that the player can't recognize that they're there.
A great way of kind of recognizing that of something that might be existing, but in a way that is just confusing or not fulfilling to the players is the example of measurable results. I think is really interesting. Is like saying you're playing a game of liar's dice, and that you can ask a player to change their dice or re-roll their dice, but you don't actually know what their dice are prior to them re-rolling. And that's sort of a form of measurable or meaningful decision that is not actually meaningful because you're not seeing these measurable results, right? So it's technically a meaningful decision that you are making in a way, but you're not understanding how meaningful that is. And so that's sort of, I think there's all sorts of little, that's a very simple version of this, but I think there's lots of little nuances that people can accidentally design into their games that, whether they recognize it or not, are sort of subverting some of these, I guess, core principles.
That's an important point to make when we're looking at how all three of these pieces are interconnected, right? In order for a decision to be meaningful, it must have some kind of impact on the outcome, which you wouldn't know unless you had measurable results, right? So, and also if the outcome was certain, your decision also couldn't be meaningful because you know how it's going to play out. And so, you know, again, we've thought a lot about these three principles, and that, you know, without any of them, I think that you don't necessarily have a complete game. It's interesting too, because some of the other attempts to define a game, it's also not to say that like this is definitive, like this is the only definition of how people could view a game. It's more of a tool for us to help work through design problems. A lot of the other attempts, I think, to sort of define a game, though, tend to do so through looking at a swath of designers or whatever, and then they'll sort of like try to come up to a definition through osmosis, right? Like, here, or consensus, right? They'll try to come up with a definition through consensus. And I don't know, I don't find that exercise particularly meaningful, right? Because you could look for patterns in how people think about games, but I think without doing that sort of subtraction down to the core of, okay, what are the like absolute necessities here, you might end up in territory that sort of sways a game in one particular direction. I think the biggest one being fun, right? I think fun or play is something that comes up a lot in terms of like what makes up a game. And I think that limits what the medium can do. And, you know, I may be getting a little lofty here, but I think that if we define games as fun being a necessity, then we're basically saying that, well, games are only an activity that explores one particular type of emotional experience, which happens to include fun, when the medium can explore as vast feelings as what a novel could. I don't think there's any reason why we couldn't enter that territory.
I think it also just kind of gets lost in the semantics and the philosophical aspects of game, which I think is interesting, and there's definitely a place to explore that. But as far as designers go, right, and us actually having to have practical advice to give people, it's the same sort of concept of, debating on whether you need to have play in order to do a game. And it's like, well, yeah, you need someone to have to participate in your game in order for your game to function. That's interesting, but is that useful when you're designing your thing? It's like, well, no, if the assumption is that someone is playing your game, that is the first step, right? Because if someone's not going to be playing your game, then you don't need to worry about it.
Well, and also just what's actually important.
Yeah.
Right? Like we can peel everything back to like just these three elements and a game exists. A meaningful experience exists.
You'll see almost every game in the world has those three things. If you enjoyed listening to us talk about complete games, please feel free to give us a little like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below. Also, if you want to keep talking about games, you can join our Discord. You can find a link to that in the description of the video.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.